So Patrick Moore, how do you like to define public history?
Well, defining public history is obviously pretty broad. As an American, I come at it from a little bit different perspective, I think, than many of our European counterparts. I've been involved with the public history profession since the early 1990s. I'm currently president of the National Council on Public History. And even at the top level of public history in the United States, we still grapple with exactly what is public history. I think from my own personal perspective and my experience working within this particular discipline, that we find that public history, not so much being public as in the public's history, but really the process by which we go about practicing our craft. I think sometimes it's probably a little bit simplistic, but saying that public history is a process, not a product. Certainly we create products, a range of things, whether it be museum exhibits or archives or digital productions, media productions. But the manner by which we reach those ends and the manner by which we communicate with our various audiences can be very different. And it evolves over time. Public history, from my perspective and what I teach my students as a professor at the University of West Florida, is how do we think about asking different kinds of questions? How do we engage with those questions to reach different kinds of ends? What we often call reflective practice. That for every project we complete, we look back on it and we enhance our methodology, we move forward based upon those needs. And the way that we assemble those questions, we ask them, we reach our products, whatever they might be, in many ways is what public history is about in my book.
So you said you had a different attitude coming from America. How would you define the difference between the European attitude and the American attitude?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily an attitude, but maybe a different perspective. I think the public history in the United States sort of formalized itself back in the late 1970s, 1977, 78, 79, 80, the creation of the National Council on Public History, a consortium of different university faculty members who recognized that there was a need for a very specific kind of methodology that many people were doing. And out of this came the, shall we say, practice of public history that became practiced at a relatively small handful of universities in the United States. But it did formalize a methodology, a training, a pedagogy that was related with how it is that we practice public history, what is it we're looking for, and how is it that we can, in many ways, justify what public history is in the light of our more traditional scholars, who may see the idea of engaged interaction, doing applied history, as being somehow less significant than more traditional scholarship. Because of the fact that they had this nexus of creation, it provided opportunities, I think, for public historians in the United States to share a commonality, whether they be in California or Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, Florida, that they could start to develop perhaps a common language, the kinds of things they were working on that had specific skills, and at least to be able to share the kinds of things they were doing with each other. By contrast, this process that went around sort of creating a central focal point for public history didn't materialize in Europe the same way. This is important to understand that I believe that some of the early founders of public history back in the 1980s somehow believed that they were the creators of a brand new type of discipline and that they needed to bring the knowledge of this new thing to their counterparts overseas. Couldn't have been farther from the truth that Europeans have arguably been doing public history far longer than anybody in the United States was doing it, and in a very tangible, formal way. Beautiful museums right here in Florence. You have some of the finest examples of public history happening for centuries. I think the difference would be is that I find from my experience working with the International Federation of Public History that just had its first meeting in October back in Amsterdam, that there's finally perhaps an opportunity through meetings like the International Federation of Public History, through the meetings like this, for those people who may not see themselves as public history, but clearly doing public history, and in an American vein would be public historians without question, to be able to communicate and share the kinds of things they're doing with each other, which could be very, very advantageous.
Feels like in America, public history is a very key part of the national identity. It seems like everybody, young children and adults, everybody knows the names of the founding fathers and the story of the Revolutionary War, and we don't really have an equivalent of that in Europe.
Well, and I think one of the great sessions that they had yesterday was this discussion in Spain in terms of how do they look at different storylines. In some ways, when they were talking about that you're starting to create through much broader conversation within the EU, at least a dialogue about how there's common threads, but at the same time, the different nationalities have had years of cooperation and conflict, and certainly national identity is a key part of it. The United States certainly evolved in a different way, and I think that narrative doesn't quite apply. Tragically, I think that most of America sees itself in a very America is the center of the world, and everything else is sort of tangential to it. And I think that's a tragedy. I don't think that there's a problem with having strong nationalism, but I think that
it's called American exceptionalism.
American exceptionalism, exactly. I was going to use that term, but didn't want to throw out something that wouldn't make sense. But I think that when you can start acknowledging what American exceptionalism is, then you're putting yourself into a context to say, why is that? And what makes you think somehow that the United States has done something that makes it exceptional? And that at least enables the narrative to come forward. How can you have a conversation about what were the other contributions and why do you have this stance? Whereas I think most young people in America, they're just taught the history of the United States as it relates tangentially to the rest of the world, whether it be Europe, whether it be Latin America, South America, Mexico, Asia, that whole narrative that takes place with the West Coast and the creation of the railways. It's a very different kind of dialogue to have within the United States that I think it lends itself much stronger here in Europe just because you've had a different interface with each other for so many centuries.
But perhaps it's a sort of defining characteristic of a superpower. I imagine that when Britain had an empire, we were very fond of thinking ourselves as somehow, because we had the Industrial Revolution as being somehow better than people in Africa and Asia, and perhaps even on the continent.
Sure, and I think that may well be. But even within that vein, I think that while that argument, the sun never sets on the British Empire and the accomplishments of the British Empire, and even then when you look back at the rise of the Spanish Empire, the discussion yesterday that the Spanish believe, we're the center of the world, and we had great contributions, that Rome brought us strength and Greece brought us knowledge, but we're all Spanish that have only managed to grow and become more prominent in the eyes of God as a result of this. I think there was at least an awareness. I'm not sure how that awareness exists in the United States, but I think that they're increasingly becoming aware that it wasn't like it was back during the Cold War.
Well, I'd be interested to know how wide the parameters of debate in Chinese public history are, right?
Some really interesting discussions that should come forward in the coming decades.
Indeed. Patrick Moore, thank you very much.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Splendid.